We're going to look at thumbnail sketching now. So thumbnail sketches are simply small sketches that represent shapes and elements that you may want to put into the final piece of your work. Here are some examples of thumbnail sketches by professionals on ArtStation. You can see that they've used their small sketches, which are very kind of rough, at least start very rough, simple shapes, before establishing something that they want to take on into the sketch and the color phase. So you can see they've created two sets of thumbnails, one for the tree here and one for the rocks of this design, and they've ended up with something like this. Then we can pop into here. You can see this person's using thumbnails a lot for silhouettes of all sorts of things, for vehicles, for plants, for parts of architecture and environments. Then over here we have more environment thumbnails. Really quickly done. This person has framed them all inside squares, but you can see a lot of details done in a short space of time, and this helps you to get a general idea of what your project could look like before you get bogged down in the details. So the important thing is we're concentrating on quantity over quality. We want lots of thumbnails. We don't want to worry about how well they're drawn necessarily. We want to get ideas out, as many as possible, in as short a time as possible. For this exercise, I took a look first of all on Pinterest and on Google Images, and through various Blizzard games, and came up with a few key images. The mood board was bigger than this, but I picked out these as ones that I want to use to influence me. I just like some of the shapes and things that were going on in these small little pieces that could be used in a diorama. Again, a diorama just being a small environment. And then I created some sketches just on line paper very quickly of some ideas that I had. So to explain to you briefly, kind of like the color scheme here with the blues, like the deep kind of colors and tones, like in the dark, and then the glowing moon here, or the glowing orb of lava here. So I kind of thought, what could I have in my scene that glows? So what I have here is a little well, and in the middle of the well there's basically lava that's kind of boiling up, or is lighting up the environment from the inside of that well. And it also has these little orb objects, 4 of them around the corners. So I've already got some ideas of where things are going to be positioned, what things might look like. I've went into the side view and I realized that a well surrounded by a couple of objects looks really boring in the side, so I've added in a structure over the well, and I was kind of influenced by this saw cutter and some of the buildings that you see here and the shapes of them. So I'm going to try and make that work in my thumbnail sketches. I'm going to explore these ideas and try and bring them on further. When using reference images, one thing that's important is to create them to make them smart objects. Smart objects can be resized without losing the resolution of the original objects. You see here I've got a sketch and I've also got a mood boards on separate layers. If I zoom out here just to see my whole canvas, Alt and scroll back, I'm going to make my sketch, Control T to transform smaller. Okay, so it's really small. So say I wanted to move it out of the way into the corner or something like that. And then what I'm going to do is Control T and make it bigger again, and you see it's lost all of that original detail and resolution. It squashed it up, and then whenever it blows it back out again, it doesn't get that back. It stays as a small image blown up. So to stop that from happening, what I can do is right click on the layer, and I can go to Convert to Smart Object. This will remember the resolution that it is currently at, and then if I resize it or reshape it in any way, you see I can resize that down as far as I want, and then whenever I bring it back up, it's going to remember the resolution that it was originally at. So smart objects are a really good way of doing that. I'm going to create that on my mood board too, just in case I have them small up in the corner. I want to be able to see the original detail that was in them, so that's creating smart objects. So right now, to give myself space, I am going to make this a good bit smaller here because I don't need it full screen. So I've got my references set up on the right hand side. The important thing is now that I don't draw over them, but I create a new layer to work on. So what I'm going to do is select both these layers, the sketch and mood board layer. I'm going to create a group by clicking on the folder icon, and then going to call that references. They're just things to guide me. And I'm going to use this lock menu that we're going to be using later on today as well. So you'll see for a folder, I can lock it down completely using this lock all button. And that means that I can't accidentally move it or select it. You see, could not use move tool because the layer is locked. I also can't draw on it with a brush tool or anything like that. Okay, so it's a really handy way of locking your layer so you don't accidentally draw over the top of it. Believe it or not all games artists, not all certainly 3D modelers can draw very well. They're good at designing, but not necessarily drawing. In fact, not all concept artists are great at drawing, but they can design well. And so what we're interested in is using basic shapes and clever tools to be able to design something that looks interesting, that looks good, without necessarily being needing to draw a whole lot. So with my sketch layer selected, I'm just using a hard round brush in black, and we're going to create some interesting shapes. So here we go. There's 3 elements that we have to do. We have to create a base, we have to create a central object, and we have to create some small objects around that. And that can be bushes, or that can be rocks, or whatever you want it to be. So let's take a look at the base first of all. Okay, I'm just going to make my brush bigger, and boom, I've got a circle there, and then E for my eraser. If I cut that off, I've already got something that looks like a base. Okay, so I'm just going to duplicate that by selecting it, Control copy, Control V to paste. Okay, and there we've got a wee duplicate of that base. What I can do is use the E eraser tool to maybe add some interest to that base. So say it comes to like a point like that or something, so that's an asymmetrical point slightly off center. So there we go, that's something that looks like a kind of rocky base. That's interesting. I could go back to layer 1 again. I'm going to copy that again. I'll select it, Control C, Control V to duplicate it, and I'm using my move tool just to move it across. Okay, so maybe that is a wee bit too harsh, too triangular, and I could instead make it a wee bit rounder. So keep with the round kind of shape, but add that kind of rocky look into it with the steep sides there. So that looks interesting. I could do a completely different shape, so I could go into my shape tools here. I got a rectangle there. I'm just going to change this from path to pixels. I could draw some pixels down, and then I could eat into that shape there, and I could, you know, kind of use that square, and then maybe that's it. Maybe I want to create cliffs around the side of my shape. Okay, so there's all sorts of ways that you can start to edit the base there. And again, we don't need to be great at drawing, we just need to be able to create things quickly, so I'm going to do that now. Okay, so what I've come up with here is 9 different options for my base, for the basic shape of the bottom of it, which is going to change the silhouette. And I've started to look at the top surface as well. So I know from my sketches and from looking at my inspiration here that I kind of want to have some grass, but I'm maybe going to have grass around the edges as if the center's been burnt in by this lava that's in the center. So I've got, you see, I've kind of like made my way down, and I've come up with this drawing that I kind of like best here, which has the idea of the rocks from this one. It has this shape from one of the early on ones. It's got the grass that I started coming up with from here. So I've slowly refined my ideas until I've come down to this, and I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do is select all these layers by pressing Shift and selecting from the top and then the bottom one, or you can press Control and select down through them all, and hold Control, that is, right click and then merge layers. Okay, so I've merged them together so they're all one. If you want to fiddle about with whereabouts things are, you can go into your tools like your lasso tool here, and you can make selections. These are a wee bit over to the side there, and you can say move things about. So I'm going to use the V tool there to move them in a wee bit, just so they're better spaced. Control D to deselect. Again, I'm going to use my L tool to grab around these, V, and then I'm going to move those in towards the center there, just so they're sitting nice and neat. So there you go. That's a nice piece of concept art for the base. And finally, I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to rename it first of all to base shapes, and then I'm going to right click it and convert that to a smart object. So if I resize it, it's not going to lose its resolution, just like it did with the reference images there. The next thing I'm going to look at is that central object, which for me is a well. So here I'm going to select my brush tool again, and I'm on a new layer here, so create a new layer, and I'm going to call this well shapes. And let's take a look at what we can create. Now I have looked at a whole bunch of different options for the well and how that could look. I kind of just like a simple well, so I'm maybe just going to go for a well with a slight lip on it. You can see I've been drawing most of these objects just using the polygonal lasso tool, and then filling them in using the brush tool, and then Control D to deselect. A really handy way of making shapes. I've got a bunch of different silhouettes and options here. I'm kind of liking, I like the one that was building-y towards the end there, like some of these buildings here with the sharp roofs. But what I think I'm going to go with is these like tentacle arm type structures, almost like big rocks or something that are breaking up out of the ground. I kind of got that from this piece of art here. So again, I haven't copied exactly what it's doing. I've just looked at some aspects of it, and then I have made them my own with this structure here. I'm going to combine all of these different layers that the things are on by selecting them both and merging them, and then I'm going to rename this central building, or whatever you want to call it. Mine's just a well, so I'm going to call it well shapes. And then again, I'm going to right click. I'm going to convert that to a smart object so that I can make it smaller and put it away while I'm working on the rest of the things, and I can bring it back up to that size if I need it again. The final thing that I'm going to work on then are some of the small objects that you can see in my sketch that surround the well. Really, this is to add some extra lighting in and to bring some more interest to the thing. So it's not just a well in the middle, but there's some little objects and things that decorate the scene and make it feel good around the area. So I've got these high structures in the middle that I kind of want to keep. Let's make some lower ones. I've got an idea of the shape of them here. So the shape idea that I've got so far is, and I should be on a separate layer here. So just creating a new layer, and I'm going to call this object shapes. And I'm going to do some exploration, starting with, so the sketches that I've kind of drawn here, and this just came out of my head. It was kind of related to these concepts that I've seen here with the moon and this orb being held by the kind of claw. I thought that I could have a base unit that is maybe a little shape like that, a little monolith, and then some sort of like little claws that come out, kind of like the shape that I've got going over here with these things. Okay, I'm going to hold shift to draw another bit, and the claws would hold, just B for my brush tilt, I'm going to paint that in, and the claws are going to hold a light source. So to denote the light source, I could do that in grey, or I could even just fire some colour in there now. So I'm going to fire in this yellowish kind of, I'm going to make it a darkish yellow so that I can see it easy enough. So I could have something like that working, or maybe to make it more visible, I'll change the colour down to this reddish kind of tone. There we go. Okay, so you can see there, already got something that kind of works around the edges, so I'm going to work with shapes here and try and get something else interesting going, or just variations of this design where I have a couple of little lights around the place, or these orbs, but I'm going to vary the shapes of the silhouettes of the objects that's holding it. Having done all that, you see I have 8 results there of my objects, and actually I'm really liking the simple ones like this one here. That is just a simple triangle, or this one that is a simple rectangle that's squashed in at the top. I think the simple ones work better than the original one that I had thought of there. But the one that I think I'm going to go with, I got the inspiration for this one, you can see, from this shape of the house inside. It's kind of like almost like a clamshell shape. I think I'm going to go with this, because this, what looks like a kind of claw, a very simple 3-fingered claw, works well with this this option that I want to go with for the well as well. So I can imagine 3 kind of central structures coming up this well here, and then maybe 3 claws sitting just outside of it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to combine my ideas into a final concept for the diorama, or at least a final idea to bring forward to look at some color and some texture options later. So I'd converted all of these to smart objects. You can tell that by the little icon that's on the layer thumbnail here. What I can do in Smart Object is to bring it back to its original size, Control T, the free transform, and you see this width and height, 67.5%. I'm going to put that back to 100, and it'll pop it back to the original size that we drew it at. So I'm going to do that for each of my shapes here. And you can see I've just used Control C, copy, whenever I've made a selection of my lasso tool, and Control V to paste. Same tools we're using all the time here to isolate or to create copies of one of each of the things that I think has worked out the best, the well and the base and the object. Now that I've got my copy of each object, one handy wee tool is we can click on the thumbnail here in Photoshop, and I can go to clip thumbnails to layer bounds rather than document bounds, and you'll see a much clearer picture of your layers. That may already be done in your version of Photoshop, but it's quite handy to see what you're working with. So I've got an object, I've got a well, and I've got a base, and they're all on separate layers here, and I'm just going to quickly work to combine those to see what the final diorama might look like in terms of its shape and its silhouette design. We have a kind of idea of how this diorama might come together. I have the central well, I have the orbs around it. I haven't indicated the light in the middle of the well, but that's maybe something I'll do in the next step, looking at textures and details and adding some colour into the design. But that's the basic shapes. The layout looks okay. It's maybe a little cluttered, so I maybe want to make the base a bit bigger, just so that everything has a bit of space to sit in. But other than that, it's looking relatively good. Relatively interesting in terms of the shapes that are going on, and if a viewer was to look at that, it may automatically catch their eye whenever they're playing a game. So in a Blizzard game, for example, it could work well as a little eye-catching piece that would draw you towards that well for a little mini boss fight or something like that, or maybe there could be an object hidden in it or something like that. So importantly, what we did was we took our shapes for each of our elements. So we created shapes for the base, we created shapes for the central object, and we created some shapes for the objects that might lie around that. So for you, that could be bushes, it could be trees, it could, much like it is in this example here. Okay, it could be anything, it could be big rocks, it could be something that's littered around. And this is just my way of doing it. Hopefully you can apply the techniques I've been using with the brush tool, the eraser tool, and the lasso tool especially, deselecting and selecting, copying and pasting, merging things in Photoshop to design really cleverly. You don't necessarily need to draw anything, you don't need to use a Wacom tablet, although they can be really handy for drawing, but focusing on shapes and making things look interesting to the viewer.